what rough beast it's our come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Je dis ce que je pense et je vis comme je veux. Je gagne beaucoup d'argent, mais quand j'en avais peu, je n'étais pas plus malheureux. Oui, mais je n'étais pas.
Hello and welcome to What Rough Beast. I'm Virginia Heffernan. I have a lot to say about political assassinations and their effect on history. I also have the counterintuitive and certainly horrifying hypothesis in my head that history takes the side of the assassin. If you want to read more about this, it's on my Substack, which is virginiaheffernan.substack.com. You can check out Magic and Loss for reflections on assassinations and most recently on Italian fascism. So I'm going to rush, though, to get to my guest because she's so interesting. She describes herself as a feral scholar, and I think that might just about do her justice. Her name's Canterel, and she works out of New Orleans. Her subjects are systems theory, technology, art, and la condition humaine. She's decoding systems of power and meaning on TikTok, and she's in the very top Substacks in philosophy. So you can find her Substack at Cybele Canterel, Cybele Canterel on Substack. So check her out. Her Substack, I should say, ranks number 15 in philosophy on Rising. It's really, really good. I came across Cy on TikTok. She's been tirelessly explaining, patiently explaining how power and meaning are shored up in the darkest recesses of the internet. This becomes especially interesting in light of the recent assassination of Charlie Kirk, where we got from the engravings on shell casings and other information that surfaced with the suspect in the assassination, we got evidence that something strange had been forming him, forming his idiom, forming his vocabulary, and perhaps forming his politics online. This is exactly what Cy Canterel exists to explain to us on TikTok. And I was so amazed by her incisiveness and her intelligence that I had to call her up and get her on the show. So Cy is joining me today, and welcome to What Rough Beast, Cy Canterel. Okay, good. Cy, welcome to What Rough Beast.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I'm really excited to be here.
So you came to my attention because one of the producers on the show, Brianna Snyder, sent me a TikTok you made in the immediate aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And you were kind of going deep on the implications of the bullet casing, that thing that we 2 weeks ago had to suddenly pretend to be experts in. And I just was struck by your brilliance. I mean,
Thank you.
scrolling through TikTok, actually amazed at how smart people are. I feel like someone should just write a book about no one's getting dumber. Everyone is getting smarter. Have you looked at TikTok? People can suddenly go deep on subjects that in ways that they couldn't have gone in the classroom, in this electrifying way. And they can talk so much more and at such a higher level than they used to do on cable news, obviously, but also in op-eds. And I loved the depth of what you had to say about the bullet casings, about groypers, about stuff that was only coming into public consciousness. So that's why I wanted to have you on the show. Cy, I don't know what your secret is. I don't know what your background is. You seem to have read everything and been to every website.
Thank you. I think one of my secret weapons is, in fact, autism. So I think that is, these are all basically my special interests that I have sort of knitted together and ingrained over the course of an entire career. And I come from a background of fine art and media studies. Once I was out of the graduate school program that I dropped out of, I went into academic think tanks for a while. So I worked with Bob Stein, who started the Criterion Collection, and that was at the Institute for the Future of the Book. And I worked with Jane McGonigal briefly at the Institute of Play. And so all of this, these ideas of complex systems and how, the problem of meaning really intersects with complex systems in technology and how we interact with other people in the real world really has preoccupied me for the entirety of my career. I did go into tech after the '08 crisis because we lost all of our funding, and was able to sort of like meander through tech, and most recently came out of working in crypto and blockchain. And
Yes.
so that also put me right front and center in a lot of these subcultures, because there's a lot of bleed in from the far right and kind of like extremist edgelord internet fringe communities into the crypto community. So I did see a lot of this in real time.
Maybe we can come back to talking about crypto and AI as crudely put, representing kind of poles of ways of thinking about the future that sort of map on to right and left. You've probably heard this argument. JD Vance has made this argument. Paul Krugman has made this argument. I've made this argument that AI, because it has a tendency to converge on accuracy, that's why it's so frustrating to Donald Trump. His AI will even say that the 2020 election was not stolen, may be more aligned with liberals, where crypto obviously plays to the vanity of libertarians, the classic people that the frontier ideology, the Electronic Frontier Foundation types from the beginning of the early internet. We're going to make a whole new place. But let's return to that. I think I might share. Well, I have a PhD in psychology from TikTok, and I want to say that what I've learned is that I probably have autism too from my
Amazing.
test I took. So I don't mind going deep into hyperfocus. So I'll follow you wherever you go.
Amazing.
My first question, and it's broad, is about, are there other people like Tyler Robinson, the suspect, or are there other people like the killer of Charlie Kirk? So that is to say hardcore anti-Kirk people, right? One thing we can say about his politics is he was anti-Kirk, the person who wanted to kill Kirk. Extremely online, part of Discord servers in the gaming community, a gun enthusiast who seems to have had some queer leanings or touched the queer world, and as his mother says, may have been pro-gay, pro-trans rights. Does this represent, because we spend a ton of time talking about who were the Trumpites, who were the January 6ers. There's a huge analysis of who all the January 6ers are. Did they have domestic abuse? Did they have economic problems? Did they have debt? And obviously we've like rended our garments forever to try to figure out who MAGA is and what shit life syndrome they might have had and how upset they might have been, how left out of a neoliberal economy they were, bent over backwards to show this world not just compassion, but understanding. We've done so much reporting, research, books on the subject. But Tyler Robinson pokes out, are there others like him? Is this a population, the 61% of Americans or the 60% of Americans who disapprove of Donald Trump? Are there Americans, is there a powder keg among this white population of young men who are like, I can't even find myself, my sexuality, and my gender in this world where I'm being crushed every day by MAGA? Does that exist?
The short answer is yes. I mean, there are, I think, a substantive number of young people, especially young white men, who are really, really struggling. You look at even just the numbers and you can see that. However, one thing that I do want to emphasize on all of this is that we, meaning the people who are sort of outside of these fringe groups, are used to seeing this polarity of right and left and assigning various ideological characteristics to either side of that dichotomy. This is outside of those types of characterizations. This is something that exists and has grown independent of and in opposition to a lot of these dominant power structures. And so it's kind of a misnomer to characterize Tyler Robinson or the more recent shooter of the ICE facility. I think he also falls into the same camp as being an outgrowth of the traditional right or the left. What these folks are reacting to is being excluded from, or the perception of being excluded from, dominant power structures, dominant narratives. So, and this is actually a problem of meaning, and it is a problem that we're seeing across society and across different groups. It's just that different groups have different ways of coping. And I think what you're seeing for folks who are, we look at MAGA, that's one way of coping. When we look at these, the fringe groups, that's another way of coping. Whether they identify more with the sort of black pill incel culture, whether they identify more with the Groyper subculture, these all kind of bleed into each other. It's very nebulous. But overall, what they feel like is there's something that they have been told that they should live up to. And there is a way to live life, to be successful, to be attractive to others, to be a part of a community. And those narratives, they can't fit themselves into. And most of them have actually tried quite hard
Yeah.
at different points in their lives to do that, and it's just not worked. And so there's a shutting down, and there's a retreat, and there's an isolation. And when they come to these online communities that are around these image boards like 4chan or 8chan or Discord servers that may even get more extreme because they're not being moderated, Telegram channels, that kind of desensitization that they're experiencing with the level of rhetoric, the level of competitive edgelord, again, like throwing in like just, contrary positions to things just to shock, just to provoke. Over time, that creates this amplification of that extremism. And it can escalate into real world violence. And I think that's what we're starting to see.
What I'm wondering, I guess, is, and actually, maybe I should back up and say, maybe tell us Black Pill and Edgelord. Tell us about those two things.
So Black Pill comes from the incel subculture, and the incel means involuntarily celibate. And that term was actually coined by a woman, interestingly enough, but it then translated over into it is not exclusively, but it is many young white men who are attracted to, again, 4chan and 8chan are, the chans.
Yeah.
It's short for channel. And this was like a type of image board, which is like a bulletin board system where people post mostly images, but also text, and where everyone is anonymous. This started in Japan, made its way over to the US in the early aughts, and then became really popular as a source for these edgy communities in the mid aughts, and has kind of inspired and radicalized a lot of young men through this. Again, incel subculture is anti-feminist and mostly and very misogynistic. And it's folks who are essentially blaming women and blaming the culture of feminism for their inability to feel like, again, that they're fitting into this traditionally attractive male alpha dominant narrative of masculinity. When you say someone is red pilled, that is the alt-right pipeline that usually starts with it can start in fitness forums. It can start with, bodybuilding, cup artistry, that kind of stuff. Sports. These young men are exposed to people who are promoting these messages about it's not you, it's actually women. It's the fact that they only want to date rich men, and 80% of women only want to date the top 20% of men. And so they slide
that 80-20 thing that showed up.
The Pareto. Yeah.
Yeah. Is also simply not true, but
right.
Also how would you verify it? So the zombie statistics that are always around those quarters are really part of the stock and trade of them, right?
And this is an emotional reality, right? This isn't like, you can't really counter these things with actual statistics, despite the fact that we try, and it's good to have that data in case you need to draw from it. But these are, when we hear people pushing these narratives, this is about an emotional reality, a felt reality. And it's using sort of statistical language to back up a felt reality. And so the red pill pipeline goes like that. So you sort of like try for a while, and you're trying to live up to this, giga chad, hyper masculine alpha dominator, like bodybuilder, and that's where like looks maxing comes in, which is a term made to like optimize your facial features, your body in these very, quasi pseudoscientific terms to be as attractive to women as possible. And when certain people fail or feel like they fail at that, then they go into black pill ideology. And that is essentially nihilism. It's saying nothing matters. Why even try? Everything's this sort of like, dark joke. And why not just watch the world burn and laugh from the sidelines? And that's sort of where edgelord comedy comes from. And that is like someone standing on the edge and taking an oppositional, defiant position toward any type of dominant power structure that they run up against, and then provoking the other person who's standing on the other side of that line just to get a reaction. And that is the sort of aggressive and offensive comedy that people will employ. And it's really just about provoking an emotional response.
Right. Okay. So they're celibate, but instead of like a sexual copulation, there's kind of this emotional interaction that stands in for love and emotion and even sex. That's to just get destabilize, destabilize women, destabilize the left, destabilize the liberal mainstream, and then just go from the corners. It's like
Right.
you picture anime figures, you picture people on message boards that inhabit that anime villain side of things. And I've even heard, by the way, that black pill, there's another expression, LDAR, among incels, that when you're black pilled, you lay down and rot. Just lay down and it gets dark, but it is so self-savaging that it
Yeah.
can kind of be funny, It can
Yeah,
kind
and
of,
that's
yeah.
that's the kind of like six of one, half dozen of the other, because like if they go down the route of like, let's say they became absurdists, then they could,
Yes.
actually cope with these things and try to find some way of filling that void without projecting all of it outward. But that really is the core of this, right? Where, it has an addictive element to it too, because like you're still seeking dopamine, you're still seeking oxytocin, and you can get addicted to the negative reinforcement pattern of
Yes.
provoking and getting a negative response, and then like that's the hit, right? So this is very similar to the type of thing that we see in MAGA, where
Mhm.
people are again looking for filling that void at the center of them by externalizing that onto the out group that they've chosen, and then provoking, getting their Fox News that tells them how angry they should be, and getting that same negative hit. So like the same psychological dynamic is in play. It's just being filtered through different mechanisms here.
I don't know your history with the internet, but by chance, there was a mainframe computer in my hometown growing up in the 70s, and I dialed into it from my house when I probably shouldn't have
Wow.
at 9, and was treated early on to this kind of vocabulary, this idiom, this style of talking. It's always been the sort of unconscious of the internet that people would
Hmm.
talk this way. I always just think of it as like you're in the basement and then upstairs in the living room, they're not talking that way, but down in the basement where the computer is, people were able to say all kinds of horrific things. And those things tilted racist from the start because the most forbidden thing to say were like Nazi platitudes and expressions. And the Merchant Marines Academy joined and they were super into it. And I just sat in like horrified silence. But I also thought that this was the truth of the world. That's one
Right.
thing it feels like when you enter the chans or when I entered that early message board or sort of a chat room, which
Yeah,
was
I'm probably a little bit behind you, but I was a Usenet kid. So
okay.
that's the
So, yeah,
precursor for Reddit, and Reddit then inherited all of their tech essentially and like reformatted it, but it's exactly the same idea. The upvoting was not as much of a thing because they didn't have that capability, but I basically lived on like in chat rooms and on Usenet until I could drive. And that was what saved
right.
me. I mean, the flip side of this is it's often what saves people. I was growing up in a really rural part of the deep South where I did not have anybody who I felt like who understood me. I went to a small private school that was a religious school. My
Mhm.
parents, I did not get along with my parents. And this was the one place I could go where I would sneak downstairs, as you say, like at night and dial in. And I could find people who it felt like I could show that part of myself to that I could not show the
Absolutely.
rest of the world. And that's unfortunately where the opening for this comes from. It's from a genuine place of hurt and feeling invalidated. And it just feeds on itself in this really negative feedback loop.
One thing I really don't like about the center left discourse around technology that we all need to away our phones and like stare at the teacher or stare at the dominant spectacle and pay attention to MSNBC rather than at our phones and our secret lives or talking in our funny codes is that it really leaves out the fact that if the one side of it was exposure, some pretty gnarly stuff, the other side of being online was this incredible liberation from time and space or from bodies in space. When people say like, well, why didn't you just go snowboarding or whatever in your childhood? I was in the North. I was like, you think if I could have snowboarded, I would have been, you know what I mean? Like, this wasn't my first choice. I
Right.
wish I had been like out dating and like, just like an awesome, cheerful kid. But I was exploring this other stuff. And as a very young person online, I also found people that I could talk to about like Reaganomics,
Right.
So I felt like understood. And I also am a person that likes to write, that likes to focus intensely on subjects. And I found my tribe. I mean, maybe we had some overlap there, but I never would have met you without the internet, and I never would have met many people in my life without the internet. And I do think it's people that control the main stage who often dislike that we're not paying attention to the main stage by looking at our phones or by playing games or whatever. So it does seem like there's a liberatory, civil liberties, if not libertarian, element of the internet that is incredibly almost euphoric and identity forming for many of us. I should say, discovered, and this goes to your work, I discovered that the group I had joined as a child, as I kind of got older, was a sort of safe space for me because it turned out to be largely a gay cruising site.
No
So
way.
for people who like, and I met some of the people later who were like, yeah, we weren't going to be predatorial with you because like you were a girl, right? My name was Athena and their names were
No.
all like Apollo, you know?
Right?
And I was like, I wonder why I don't get any action here. But
Oh my God.
anyway, the queer life, the underground queer life that dovetailed on the Chans with some of the right-wing discourse. Tell us a little bit about that and a little bit about sort of gender bending or gender trouble among the far right, like Groypers.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I think there's shades and flavors of this where, again, it's not when people think of the Groypers, it's not this like very organized group with like a membership roster that they keep secret and all that stuff. So that you can sort of like kind of bend in and out of these spaces and be like, oh, I've gone too far in one direction. I need to go back to where I was.
Yeah.
So there's, and that is what also gets people kind of like in this orbit, and they may not even realize they're in that orbit until it's sort of too late.
Yeah.
But what we see is like, again, when you have a bunch of pieces of yourself that you feel like you can't show to the outside world, and you go to these spaces and you feel like you find like-minded folks, a lot of that like identity instability can be gender identity. And with the younger group of people, again, younger people are always kind of like more experimental in the first place. And so with these spaces, that becomes like it's an oppositional stance also to adopt a fluid gender identity, because it also makes people very uncomfortable the same way that racist statements make people very uncomfortable. So it can be adopted oppositionally. I won't say it's necessarily like a theory, but there's like an attachment to Greco-Roman ideals in the Groyper subset that, harkens back. This is again, like, Nazi Germany pulled on the same lineage, where they say, well, it's actually gay to have sex with women, because you are not like, if men are the truly superior group and the alphas are meant to rule, then the most masculine thing that someone who cannot be an alpha can do with their masculinity is to support an alpha in their sexual needs and so this is where you get that transmaxing, or even to become a woman for support an alpha. And I heard somebody on TikTok actually say this is akin to the idea of a like prison wife. And it is kind of a similar idea. So it's like, it becomes a totalizing ideology where, everything is contained within this almost Aryan, supremacist, ideology, but it is actually being much more open to gender fluidity and to queerness.
And I feel like there's a certain admiration of an extremely masculine type for especially the kind of cartoonish masculinity that was like in some versions of bodybuilding culture and, and gay culture generally. So it's not as unusual as it seems. And it also sounds like you're exactly right to point out these are image boards, which I don't always think about the Chans as image-based because I don't visit them that much. And so what percolates up to me and what's more quotable are things that have been said on them. But people posting images, like just sort of snickery kids posting images of Nazis and swastikas and violence and the camps and rape fantasies, are also sometimes posting images of themselves dressed in really high Aryan way, like with makeup, but that tilts into a kind of feminized, and I guess what they call a femboy look. And so a lot of this is about posing, right?
It's performative and it's spectacular. It's spectacle based.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of also what the culture of the image boards encourages through its mechanics, because the things that get the most interaction, the posts that get the most interaction go to the top. And that's another competitive aspect of this, because you can sort of win, right? You can win for a given post.
Oh yeah.
And if your post gets no interaction or little interaction, it falls to the bottom and it dies. And so this is also how the desensitization and the extremism gets more and more and more pronounced, because the most inflammatory, the most outlandish, the most quote unquote edgy content will rise to the top.
There is so much quant on the boards that what's interesting, I think, for people upstairs in the living room, that when we talk about things that they're talking about too, like love and sex, right? They are putting so many numbers on things that they've lost the plot, right? Like I was just reading Ben Franklin's advice for sort of debate, actually. And it's basically advice for cultivating relationships. Like don't talk too much, don't interrupt, ask people a lot about themselves, but don't ask too intrusive questions. Don't talk too much about yourself. Don't be Abe Simpson and tell boring stories. And really, he says, well, he doesn't mention Abe Simpson, except that he's so prescient that he does. But the advice that you could give, or a mother could give a would-be incel, of, just like put on a clean shirt and ask a girl some more questions about herself, right? That probably could maximize its chances of getting laid, but also are simply a way to interact in the world. Like, how do you ask a girl to dance at a school dance? Or just the simple personality stuff gets replaced. It's not like we weren't all strategizing to try to go on dates. Like, that's something that people do. But, it's not like it comes perfectly natural to the blue-pilled people who are just like horrified that anyone has to think this through. It's just that where before people might have done psychoanalysis, investigated their dreams, their deeper desires, their id, here on the Chans or on other boards like this, they quantify things out of existence, basically. They start saying, using calipers to measure how a face should look in order to attract a woman. And it sort of has a like, why don't you just pick up a copy of, X Social Guide to Manners and figure out how to pull out her chair or whatever, open the door, or, or look her in the eye, or like all the kind of normal advice from Jane Austen, right? They could have done that, and instead they retreated to numbers. And how you get from that to upvotes or to the basic quantification of human relationships is a really rocky and weird path that I don't think translates to a lot of normal people.
If you zoom out from that particular issue, because we all experience some aspect of that. I mean, women, good Lord, like how many times did I weigh myself? How many times did I measure the circumference of my thigh?
Yes.
Like my mother herself has had eating disorders on and off for my entire existence. And so it was like her battle and my battle and like all of these other things. It's the quantification. And then again, to me, like what I think of is the quantification of meaning and how meaning gets co-opted and sold back to you as a consumer product, right? Because what you want is to be accepted, validated, and part of a community that sees you as a valuable asset to that community. And we want status, right? Like we do. We want to be looked at and validated in that way, seen as valuable. But when the only thing that has value is things that make other people money, then we have a real problem as a society. And so that's where these kids, like, I just think of myself, and if you could see my junior year group photo, it's like hilarious. There's just all these like jock kids, right? Yeah. And they've got their like tube socks and their, gym outfits. And then there's me who had a bowl cut and I dyed black and I was wearing, like goth, like I was a goth.
Yeah.
There's no way that if I was like also expressing that aspect of myself, that I could have just acted the way they acted and gotten the same results. And I think there's this like problem that we have is like how to validate people who are pushing at the edges and questioning the authority of these narratives, but not to drive them out into the hinterlands so that they become the scapegoats for society's ills.
I think that is spot on. Thinking about you in Mississippi, or very close to New Orleans, but technically Mississippi growing
up.
Too
far to make a difference when you can't drive.
Right, too far to make a difference. Yes. I mean, New Orleans, great place of self-invention and sexual fluidity and gender fluidity. But yeah, as you say, too far away. Back to Tyler Robinson, and I'm going to assume, since we have some documentation that says he confessed, and he's certainly the chief suspect in the case, that I'm going to connect him to the killer of Charlie Kirk, also because all journalists seem to be doing it. So in the endless amounts of research and documentation about the January 6ers, about the people that stormed the Capitol, there's a huge amount of evidence that most of them came from blue states. So what you're looking at is the minority population of voters, anyway, who are slowly getting madder and madder, that they're like fighting with their families, they're fighting with their communities, their towns, they're trying to find like-minded people, and they're no doubt doing what you and I did when we were growing up. They're going online to find those people. Maybe they're watching Joe Rogan, or they're even watching black-pilled material, but they're carving out their identity. And I'm going to think separately of both violence and voting, right? They're carving out their identity, and their identity might put them at odds with their surroundings, like you with your black bowl cut, and or me not snowboarding, and that puts them in a maybe precarious psychological place, but maybe in a place where the nonviolent ones, the non-extremist ones, they could be the ones that kind of change the world, right? Like we want to have a lot of goth kids, a lot of punk kids, but we don't want a lot of white power skinheads. But it might come with the territory that you would have to have a country that's filled with the kind of artists and innovators that our civil liberties are sort of enshrined to produce, that act on their freedom in this self-inventing way, like gay people, like people in all kinds of interesting subcultures, like autistics, right? You want them to be able to find each other, make new things, do new things, while also, the society should hedge against them. As in the early days of the internet, you want to hedge against child porn, you want to hedge against runaway capitalism. So like, so much of the quant-based scheming online is about how to get rich. There was a time when I also was in eating disorder hell, where I decided that every self-help book was either how to be too thin or too rich, like, because you can never be too thin or too rich, right? Like, the American thing was like,
You're onto something.
but make yourself as small, right? And just numbers, optimizing, whatever. But so you don't want those things to run out of control, but there also is a minority, although now a heavy majority disapproves of Donald Trump, but there could be a minority in these states that is motivated, but not extremist. And what I'm wondering is if Tyler Robinson, the same way a share or is better than a like you on a post, right? A share or a comment is like worth that many likes to at least Facebook. So I'm going to use their quantification model. So one assassination suggests that there is someone mad enough at Charlie Kirk, like the assassination of Martin Luther King suggested there were people that were mad enough at civil rights, right, to get to that extreme point. But maybe under him, there are people frustrated with MAGA in a more productive way. I mean, this is a hopeful way to look at it. But other people on his Discord board, or his roommate who, helped turn him in and collaborated with the FBI, might be like, yes, I fucking hate this. Like, we've been sitting here in Utah for all this time, told that we shouldn't exist, that we need to be wiped off the earth, and nothing is taking this pain away. And I'm 22 and I'm still not able to like live my life and live my truth. And I hate this. And I need to be able to, if I'm not going to completely John Brown out, I need to have a sense of solidarity, that there are people with me who see this as inhumane.
I think that is accurate for a subset. I do also think, like, when we think about, and again, this is all alleged and perspective, right? I'm just like taking my brain and I'm like, if I was in this person's brain, then maybe I would make these choices. But that is always, so speculative.
Yeah.
Knowing what I know about these subcultures and about how they operate, it is possible that Tyler Robinson, if he is indeed the shooter, did not even hate necessarily Charlie Kirk, right? That this may not be, this could literally be because people do get this nihilistic. I mean, a lot of the people who participate in these types of acts of violence, like a lot of them are school shootings, right? They don't hate children. They hate life.
Right.
And so I think like Charlie Kirk, if we think of this as opposed to these fringe groups, and again, I don't know if this is his motivation, but Charlie Kirk represented a very rigid interpretation of traditional values.
Hmm.
Charlie Kirk said the only way that you can be a productive member of society is to be in a heterosexual marriage, to have children, to have a job, preferably doing something that, is with your hands, right? This, like, again, very traditional interpretation of masculinity. And, you have to be Christian. You have to it's super rigid. And so that is a person who represents those dominant systems just as much as maybe even more so than a liberal senator, right? A neoliberal senator.
Right.
And so I think that's another way to look at it is if you're an edgelord and you're just taking a posture against these like entrenched systems of power, Charlie Kirk is just as much a representation of that, if not more, than a lot of other people are. And it's not so much like I'm super angry at Christian nationalism per se, or I hate his ideology about trans people. Like that assumes a sort of logical progression from like a grievance through to an action. And I think in these cases, a lot of times that does not exist in the way that we're used to thinking about it. It's more like this is the ultimate provocation.
We assign much more coherent ideological paths to different groups of people, right? This is a non-binary politics that in some ways lives to confound the parents, the same way that non-binary sexuality confounds people that can't change their pronouns. It just like calls attention to the fixed patterns in your brain if you can't refer to a single person as a they, them. And I think that is what's interesting about the non-binary, about what you're describing about either the horseshoe or the what side are you on. What I am more dispirited to hear about is just the open nihilism. So I've been thinking about past assassinations. I don't know if you have too. Most of them, I was born after the Kennedys, after Malcolm X, after Martin Luther King. So the main ones that, really, really set the left back and gave us Nixon. And must have been just absolutely horrifying to live through, whatever your politics. But some of them were politically motivated. So, and some of them were like, just God help you if you try to figure out Lee Harvey Oswald's motivations at this late date. But King's assassin, who is still celebrated by many on the right, and obviously Kirk hated Martin Luther King and said many times that he thought he was a horrible person. So the anti-civil rights position of his killer was really clear. And he was a straight segregationist, and he intended to take King out to bring civil rights to his knees. And very tragically, he did it. It was, Johnson was out and Nixon was in shortly after that. And so maybe that guy is acting completely in random desperation, but maybe it's a coherent act of war. And we have heard the right, and I'm sure on Discord and I'm sure in video games, think a lot about the current situation. Everyone talks about it this way, as if the country is just out war. And with segregation and its reverberations from the Civil War, that played out apparently for that shooter. So what if, I'm just proposing this, and obviously we are freestyling so much about someone we know very little about. But what if, even just as an act of meaning making or a performance, what if the assassination of Charlie Kirk is a shot over the bow, is an effort to take out a serious field general in MAGA? And if that's how it plays, so that whatever they say about everyone's not grieving right, or you're not saying the right thing about Charlie Kirk or Jimmy Kimmel, this, that, is secondary to the fact that they lost this person, and that in the world of hard power that this takes place, that this was a significant blow to MAGA, just as the assassination of King was a significant blow to civil rights.
I think so. And this gets to some of what Candace Owens has been saying on her
really
channels
at our time.
And I think this is where, if I had to guess, my best educated guess is that would not be true for Tyler Robinson. I think again, this is me extrapolating, but I think I would not take the position that his actions were motivated by an attempt to depotentiate or destabilize a particular movement. I would say that for him, it likely represented a provocation that could, from an accelerationist perspective, could make both sides fight each other to the point that they would destabilize the society at large. And that is the idea of accelerationism from the extremist perspective, which is to push at these sociocultural seams, these friction points, but through either violence or just extreme confrontation to make society essentially fall apart because they see it as unsalvageable already. And so the only thing to be done is to try and provoke the end of things. But if you look at people like Candace Owens and what she's saying right now, it's very hard, I think, for people to grok that that would be enough of a motivation for somebody to do something like this. And so that's why I think we see these narratives of higher salience coming from people like Candace Owens, because it makes a lot more sense to the folks who saw Charlie as this potential carrier of the flame for the Christian nationalist movement. Well, he is so important that it can't just be some random person that was taking him out for, provocative purposes. It has to be Israel. It has to be, and then I think she said recently the Etsy witch and it's witchcraft. And this is a spiritual warfare thing.
Right.
So I think that is getting at, like, again, the worldviews sort of like, vibrating and becoming like inflamed against each other a little bit.
Yeah. God, I can't help wanting that salience so much.
I know.
But it seems, well, I guess it seems so. RFK was shot over Israel, but I mean, that was at least in the manifesto of the shooter. JFK, we have no idea. Malcolm, I mean, it's just bewildering. Malcolm X was shot by another Nation of Islam person. So that would be like the Candace Owen Groyper idea that they're arguing that the right among themselves, or like a piece of this kind of movement or this group, is arguing over, once again, Israel and possibly the Epstein files, which is another nexus of dispute in the right. Is that right? Like Candace Owens and
she's
Tucker
essentially,
Carlson.
yeah, she's alleging that it was a state action by Israel because
Great.
Charlie was considering walking back his support for Israel.
Yes.
And that he was getting pressure from major donors because his rise was funded by a lot of these groups that are AIPAC related. And that she is saying that he had tried to walk back his position and had gotten a lot of pressure and veiled threats. But he was privately thinking about still going against the official position that he had been told to toe the line on with Israel. And that she's sort of like, I think they assassinated him because of his, because he was about to change his views. And so that again is like the high salience idea where it's like, oh, this all falls within a pattern of behavior that points toward a given policy end or a way of taking the party in a given direction or the movement in a given direction versus the abrupt entrance of chaos, which is like very hard for the human brain to make sense of. And so we really try hard. We grasp at every available straw to fit this into a tidy narrative. And, for one side, for the administration, that's the left is the source of all of this violence. For the left, it's the right is the source of all this violence, which, to be fair, if you look at the available data, there's a really great open data set. I recently did a TikTok on this that did not get so much traction, maybe because of its like deep dive into statistics.
I loved it. It was great. Yeah.
But to look at the profiles in individual radicalization in the United States, which is a project at the University of Maryland that has examined all acts of extremist violence or attempted acts of extremist violence, politically motivated, since 1948 up through 2022. And you do find that overwhelmingly, something like 70% of the time, this is coming from motivated by right-wing ideology.
I guess I'm also interested in the sort of terror that this as a terrorist act, right? Like, which is potentially somewhat different from a straight up political act. It's like there's an element of desperation that might not be there. It's not like shots at Fort Sumter so much as just like the IRA randomly blowing up a car, because it's kind of near the parliament. I guess I'm interested in why, in the context for like some of the worries about where violence comes from, that seems to express a part of the terror, right? That we're like acting within the terror that this assassination was intended to create by citing statistics saying it's not my side, it's the other side, don't come after me, without maybe paying attention to the fact that a high level of motivation, even if it looks like schizophrenia, or it looks like John Hinckley wanting to impress Jodie
Hinckley's
Foster, right?
exactly.
Hinckley's a great example. But it's such a dramatic act that something has to get you to get your gun and go do this thing. And we've all called it political violence because he was a political figure. It wasn't like we don't think that Charlie Kirk was like sleeping with his girlfriend or whatever, and that this was a crime of passion where he was shooting a romantic rival. It might turn out it was, but it doesn't look like it. And every European leader and every leader on right and left seems to call this political violence. So if it is political violence, it seems to me at least as likely that it seems like actually somewhat far-fetched to immediately say that he's a chaos agent going for accelerationism, since that's not typically what gets people to get their guns. I mean, when I'm wondering, like, the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand was like an attack on royalists. It's not, that did lead to a ton of chaos, possibly the attack on the Twin Towers, but accelerationism actually seems like a really evolved and collapsitarianism and stuff, really like a seminar way to start thinking, or like something to espouse on 4chan or 8chan, or even in a book by Peter Thiel, or a lecture on the Antichrist by Peter Thiel. But as for something that gets you to enact violence, lethal violence, I'm not sure that there are a lot of it.
I think when we look to precedents, it is more useful to look at school shootings
Yeah.
than it is to look at high level, like politicized or political assassinations. And when we look at the rhetoric that that is propagated on these boards,
Yeah.
a lot of it is gamer rhetoric, which is not to say that gamers are the problem, right? At
Right.
all. Or playing video games is the problem at all. But when you think about the mechanics of technology, that sort of, and again, about the desensitization feedback loop that you're exposed to if you marinate in these environments for a long time, the verbiage that people use, the rhetoric people use is things like, well, you got to beat this person's high score.
Right.
Right. And so
Yeah.
it actually derealizes the act. And it's sort of like, again, with, when you're really young and your frontal lobe's not completely developed and you've been marinating in this discourse and this ideology that is derealizing like all of the social taboos and really aestheticizing violence, then you can even sort of start to lose the distinction between something that is in the game world or in your mind and in reality. And I think for a lot of these young men, this is like the final moment of the tipping point of getting pushed over into action from a kind of building up of a battery of despair and anger. And so it might be that, Tyler Robinson picked Charlie Kirk, not because, Charlie Kirk was there in his state. He knew he was coming.
Yep.
And B, because Charlie Kirk had a lot of attention. And this would be a very spectacular act of violence. And that might be as much about why he was picked as anything else.
Yeah.
And it got tons of attention.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it did. I mean, yeah, absolutely. And in that way, it could be closer to the John Hinckley or go out in a blaze of glory kind of idea that some of the early manifestos of the school shooters, or just like the giant massacrists in Norway are. I remember for a while, I know now they tilt manosphere, but for a while they were by atheists who believed everyone was sheep. Whereas religious terrorism, that's I'm going to go to heaven. This was just like, it was pretty black pilled. It was like everyone's an idiot was their ideology,
And
right?
this is the same. This
This
is
is the same.
the same.
This is the same.
This is,
Okay.
and again, it's like we are the only ones who understand the
Yes.
reality of the world.
Yeah.
And we are standing apart from and above all of these people who have rejected us,
Yes.
and everyone who is engaging with these dominant systems
Right.
is an idiot. And so we
Yeah.
are calling out their idiocy and making them feel, making them feel as bad as they've made us feel, essentially.
Right. Right. You'll ache like I ache. I mean, I guess to wrap this up, what I really like about talking to you is I think we actually have a meaningful difference in how we're sort of
Mhm.
reading the act. And I think that to see it as accelerationist, to see it as in some ways dovetailing with ways of seeing the world in gamer culture where like death isn't death and you get extra lives and you beat people's scores, and then also message board language about domination and master of the wrist mogging or whatever it is, where you like have a bigger wrist so you're the master of the group. I mean, this stuff gets really crazy, but that this was this edgelord flex that was black pilled, nihilistic, and meant to cause chaos without sort of an ideological agenda. That seems entirely persuasive to me. In my differential diagnosis, I think that it's possible that he's the tip of the iceberg for, and I'm taking this from the scraps of text that we have that he seemingly produced, or at least the New York Times agrees he produced the text with his roommate and some of the things that his Discord pals said about him. I think it's possible that was just a heavily armed version of a lot of white guys who, like the ones that from their shit life or from their like, terror about the world ahead of them or whatever, went right. He went left in the sense that he felt like he wanted the same freedoms he had with guns with his sexuality and gender. And I'm just going on what his mother said of him, but that the stifling of those freedoms in red states may be getting to some of the white men there. And that
I think that's accurate. And I think that's accurate in general. And the stifling of these dominant narratives is getting to young men. That's absolutely true. I think that
yeah,
is 100% true. And that is what's driving a lot of young men into these spaces.
yeah,
I don't know that, like, I would necessarily say that that would be a strong enough predictor based on what I know of any of these spaces to incite such a spectacular act.
yes, yeah,
I think it's likelier that I think it's likelier if all of the evidence that we have is accurate, and that's a
hmm
big if. I don't necessarily trust this version of the FBI, but I would tend to say that there was something that he was keeping even from his like Discord group, right?
yes,
Because the way that they are portraying him as someone who is very reserved, but very, they never had anything, to say about him trying to be provocative or
hmm
driving them away. Like something was going on at a deeper level.
hmm
And that might have even included things that he was keeping from everyone but himself.
right,
And that, what goes on in somebody's mind between themselves and even the things that they read,
yeah,
that may not even be fully formed thoughts to themselves. But my guess is something actually like catalyst event
hmm
drove this particular action, even if it was small. It was like the straw that broke the camel's back. What that is, I
hmm
don't know if we'll ever know. And
hmm
again,
yeah,
some of this similar
yeah,
similar type of evidence, is coming out. Not that so much he left behind sort of meme based evidence,
hmm
but his friends are saying similar things where he had gotten very deep into 4chan. He had become an edge lord. He had driven his friends away through offensive humor,
hmm
and had gotten really isolated in the last couple of years. And, so it's a similar story with this person as well, where they don't
hmm
have a coherent ideology and they aren't aiming at a particular policy goal. It
yes,
is a sort of self-immolation, and I'm going to take
yes,
some people with me in a way
yeah.
that will be a natural attention magnet.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we absolutely agree that online is the place to look. In old stories about serial killers from the 60s and 70s, the heyday of serial killers, there was always this like biting psychoanalytic analysis of them as having a mother complex, this, that, right? you look to some place that you see the unconscious, and the unconscious or something like it does play out in online spaces, in gaming, on Twitch, on alt-right, and even some of the new lefty political pundits on Twitch, including Hassan Piker, and people that most of our listeners are probably not listening to. But that is, I think, where you might look for the repository of the kind of things that are driving young men and people in these spaces. And I hope we'll just continue to talk, because if this is somewhat a copycat, if this guy that shot up the ICE facility and killed detainees was at all emboldened by political violence, including this attack on Kirk, we may be just seeing a lot more of it and have a very destabilized polity.
I mean, I think this is, again, it's like some of the things that happened during the 60s with, again, the very spectacular, it was also a very spectacular acts, right?
Yes.
And I think you get into mimetic violence, and that is absolutely something, because you're already in a cycle of desensitization and emotional blunting. Then you can see these things happening in the world and say, well, maybe now is my time. You know, and it does sort of inspire the ability to actually act out these things versus just keep them inside.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, Sai.
Yeah, thank you, Virginia.
This episode of What Rough Beast is dedicated to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who came on the Ezra Klein show, having been critical of Ezra Klein, and discussed in detail what our obligations are to those who are grieving for Charlie Kirk, and whether they might be brought into a broader democratic coalition, or, as Coates argues, whether the important value here is staying close to our own principles and proceeding on those principles, whether or not it means forfeiting the participation in the left of people whose views are racist and unsavory. I just went to like a pinball museum in Asheville.
Oh my God, I love pinball.
Pinball's the best.
I used to be in a pinball league in New York when I lived there.
Really? This episode of What Rough Beast was produced by Richard Stanislaw. Brianna Snyder edited and co-produced the show, and John Jeremiah Sullivan recorded our theme song, Je dis que je pense et je vis comme je veux, which was originally written and recorded by the French pop star Antoine. You can subscribe to our show at whatroughbeast.com or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find me at virginiaheffernan.substack.com. I'm Virginia Heffernan. On behalf of Stephen Metcalf and the What Rough Beast team, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on What Rough Beast. Okay, so maybe you'll agree with me. What was wrong, right? We didn't like put an index on the ball in pinball. You're just like, I lost a ball. You weren't like, I lost a life. And when you got an extra ball, you just got another ball. You didn't get another you. I feel like the problem is when we abandon physical pinball with just like, it's a test of your skill with your hands instead of like weird. It's like when pinball turned into video games.
I know, but think back to Tommy.
Right.
And that was like a corollary to the type of video game, like, you know, the stereotype of the video gamer now, because Tommy is autistic and, you know, just like obsessed with it. And you like, even just seeing him, like, he's a cyborg, right?
Oh my God. Wait, are you going to please do a Tommy TikTok? Please. I will share it with everyone on my network. That's actually so genius.